April 2011 was a record-breaking month for tornadoes. That month, 771 tornadoes touched down. That is, on average, 25 to 26 tornadoes a day, and 1 to 2 tornadoes every hour. However, 360 of those tornadoes occurred in only 4 days. From April 25th to April 28th, a series of thunderstorm complexes moved through much of the country, spawning tornadoes from Texas to New York that killed over 320 people and caused over $10 billion in damage. In this two-part documentary, we will go over everything, from the science behind it to the tornadoes themselves. Hi, I'm Pat from Pat's Path Predictor, and welcome to the 2011 Super Outbreak documentary. In this two-part documentary, we will go over everything that happened during the 2011 Super Outbreak, from the SPC outlooks to the tornado watches, all the way to the tornadoes themselves. And we will also talk some of the science behind it, the setups of those days, and a bunch of other things that led to the ridiculous amount of instability that happened in those 4 days. Welcome to part 1 of the two-part documentary series on the Super Outbreak. April 2011 was the most active month for tornadoes in United States history, shattering the previous record of 503 in May of 2003, and obliterated the old April record of 267 from April 1974, the month of the catastrophic 1974 super outbreak that resulted in 319 deaths and over 5,000 injuries.
Well, yeah, the super outbreak was previously the record holder for the most tornadoes in the U.S. in 24 hours. That occurred from parts of, central Indiana, Illinois, all the way down to Alabama and Mississippi. Basically, that tornado outbreak, we saw 148 tornadoes in 24 hours on April 3rd, 1974. And of those 148, we had 30 that were F4 or F5, which is by far the most violent tornadoes ever recorded in a single outbreak.
On April 4th and 5th, a tornado outbreak consisting of 46 tornadoes kicked off the month of endless tornadoes. This outbreak killed 9 people and caused $2.8 billion in damage, which unfortunately was the catalyst for other events. Another tornado outbreak, which would occur a few days later from April 9th to April 11th, and this time would produce 49 tornadoes, including one EF4, which was included in this outbreak. Thankfully, no one was killed, but 21 people were injured, and $2.2 billion of damage was caused.
The EF3 in Mapleton, Iowa, though, that was a really interesting tornado. That one had a lot of good chaser footage of it. Moved through the town of Mapleton in the early evening hours. And fortunately did not kill anyone, but from what I remember, it destroyed like 75% of that town. It was a small town, maybe a few hundred to 1,000 people
Similar to Greensburg.
Yeah, but fortunately they had a lot of warning, a lot of lead time, and everyone there who was there at the time took shelter. So no deaths and very few injuries from that outbreak.
Things only took a turn for the worse as the month progressed. From April 14th to April 16th, a massive tornado outbreak occurred, and tornadoes were spotted from the Great Plains to the Carolinas. In this outbreak, an impressive 178 tornadoes were confirmed. However, all of them were EF3 or weaker. Nevertheless, it made up for that with extremely large hail, the largest of which measured in at a staggering 4.25 inches in diameter. Tragically, 38 people were killed and almost 600 were injured, which was, at the time, the most fatalities in a tornado outbreak since the 2008 Super Tuesday tornado outbreak.
The third day of the outbreak, April 16th, we actually saw a high risk in North Carolina, right through the cities of Raleigh, Cary, Dunn, all those populated areas. And we had a lot of tornadoes that day, including a long track EF3 that went right through downtown Raleigh, actually. It was on the ground for 85 miles, mile wide. Quite a few deaths that day, lots of damage. Definitely one of the more severe tornado outbreaks in the Carolinas.
From April 9th to April 24th, there was a sequence of tornadoes that occurred across much of the country, particularly in the Midwest and Great Plains. The most known tornado to occur in this time frame was the Good Friday EF4 tornado that hit the St. Louis metropolitan area, including Lambert International Airport on April 22nd. This tornado was also the strongest of the sequence, with winds of 170 miles per hour.
St. Louis tornado, very fortunate that it missed, the most populated parts of the city, because otherwise, an EF4, that could have killed a lot of people, especially in a place where, might not have the best infrastructure to handle a tornado of that strength. And it did impact the airport, but fortunately the damage there wasn't too horrendous. It did destroy like a few hangars and then blew out some windows, and there was this one video on YouTube that has like 10 million views of the tornado as it's going through the airport. Someone recorded from the terminal. So, yeah,
Interesting.
It was a very popular tornado video. Yeah, that could have been a lot worse, though.
No one was killed and only 14 were injured, 5 of which were in the St. Louis area. However, this good fortune would not last, as the day after the sequence was over, a series of tornadoes would change weather history forever. By this point, there were already over 400 tornadoes confirmed in the United States for the month of April. However, this was just the tip of the iceberg, as on April 25th, everything changed. Some of it changed forever. April 25th, 2011 was the start of what would become known as the 2011 superoutbreak. That day, 50 tornadoes were reported, some of which were pretty strong. There was a moderate risk issued for parts of Arkansas, most of Arkansas, as a matter of fact, as well as parts of Missouri and the surrounding area. In this section of the video, we will be going over everything from both the tornadoes themselves as well as the behind the scenes and how this thing got so big. On April 25th, 2011, the superoutbreak began. The Storm Prediction Center, or SPC for short, issued a moderate risk for severe weather. The moderate risk included almost all of Arkansas and parts of Missouri, western Tennessee, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, and Oklahoma. The tornado risk issued by the SPC included a 15% risk of tornadoes within a hatched area, which means there is a 15% risk of strong tornadoes classified as EF2 to EF5 strength by the SPC within 25 miles of a certain point. Now, that doesn't seem like a lot at face value, but understand that a 15% risk for tornadoes is actually very high compared to other severe hazards, due to both how dangerous they can get and how tornadoes are much smaller than the storm itself.
Now, 15% is, contrary to what most would think, is a pretty serious threat, So basically, the SPC issues risks based on, nowadays they have general thunderstorm, marginal risk, slight, enhanced, moderate, high. Back in 2011, we just had the slight, moderate, and high risks. But yeah, basically a 15%, that means you're going to see, quite a few tornadoes over, over the circled area. So
the wind threat for that day was at 30% for parts of Arkansas, Missouri, Illinois, Kentucky, Tennessee, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, and Oklahoma. What that means is that there is a 30% risk of winds of severe potential, which is 50 knots or 58 miles per hour within 25 miles of a certain point.
2-inch hail is about the size of a chicken egg, so that's definitely going to cause some damage to your car. If it gets bigger than that, over baseball size, then it can go through your roof, smash windows. Yeah, it can do a lot of damage. And it can be dangerous if you're outdoors in it without some sort of protection on your head.
The hail threat was also at 30%, but it had a hatched area around it. For hail, in this instance, a hatched area means that there is a 30% risk of hail that is 2 inches or greater in diameter within 25 miles of a certain point.
30% risk, that's, you're going to see a good bit of wind damage across, isolated areas, but nothing too severe. Like, if you get 60 to 75 mile per hour winds, which is what you'd expect in that range,
All right.
you might see some tree damage, power lines. Still could be dangerous if a tree falls into your house or power line just falls into your house or anything like that, but that's really not the worst.
In the SPC synopsis, it is stated that, quote, an active severe weather day is likely from the southern plains into the lower Mississippi Valley. It also mentions that there is a very strong shear and instability favorable for supercell and tornado development. The next few images are SKUTs of observations that were made on April 25th in select locations. In those SKUTs, we'll show you the amount of CAPE, the cap, and the amount of shear it includes. Before we talk about the results of the SKUTs, we must first talk about how they work. SKUTs measure temperature, dew point, and plot a parcel path into the upper atmosphere. In simple terms, the green line is dew point and the red line is temperature, while the black line is the parcel path. If the parcel path is to the right of the temperature, that means it is saturated, and the space between the parcel path and temperature is the convective available potential energy, or CAPE for short. The more CAPE you have, the more severe weather is possible. How large the CAPE is depends on how much space between the parcel path and temperature there is. Countering this CAPE is the amount of stable air there is below the CAPE, more commonly known as the cap. If there is a strong cap, the severe weather is less likely due to the amount of stable air countering the CAPE. However, if the cap is weaker, the CAPE can easily overcome it. If the cap breaks, it breaks explosively and potentially permits lots of severe weather to occur. In central Arkansas, by 12 UTC or 7 a.m., the CAPE was at 3.31 joules per kilogram, which is pretty minuscule at that point. However, by 18 UTC, which is 1 p.m., the CAPE was at 637 joules per kilogram, as shown by the SKUT here. By 7 p.m., which is 0 UTC, it was at 1,752 joules per kilogram. Now, 1,752 joules per kilogram, that is a decent amount of CAPE right there for some severe weather. For those of you who do not know, 2,000 joules per kilogram of CAPE or more means you have a conducive environment for some pretty bad severe weather. 1,700 is cracking close to that.
Now, at the surface level, 1,752 CAPE might not be super high. In the plains, when it comes to tornadoes up there, you might need 4,000 or 5,000 CAPE for supercells to really get going. But it's a little bit different in the deep south of the U.S. because a lot of these storms have much stronger forcing mechanisms like cold fronts, low pressure systems that are centered pretty close by, and a lot more wind shear coming right off the Gulf with that warm air advection. So you don't need as much of that CAPE, and really anything over 1,000, depending on the day, will get the job done.
Shreveport, however, was a completely different story. At 12 UTC, it was at 1,483 joules per kilogram of CAPE, which is a considerable amount, and that only goes up. By 18 UTC, which is 1 p.m., it goes up to 2,042 joules per kilogram, and by 0 UTC, it goes down, however, to 1,327 joules per kilogram. So the environment was already unstable before, and by 18 UTC, it only got even more unstable, and that's what prompted the moderate risk. On this day, 50 tornadoes were confirmed, all of which were EF3 or below. One of the most notable tornadoes is the one that struck Volania, Arkansas, causing substantial damage and killing 4 people in the process.
Now, this day was a very high precipitation type storm mode, so there weren't a whole lot of strong tornadoes, but then in the evening we did have some storms on that day around the Little Rock area. One in particular in the town of Volania, Arkansas, which was an EF2, high-end EF2, over a mile wide, so very large tornado. This one tracked about 52 miles, so very long path, and it did kill several people, demolished a lot of mobile homes. Once again, why if you live in a mobile home in a place that gets a lot of tornadoes, you should definitely look for a good place to take shelter.
In the end, a total of 5 people were killed in this first phase of the outbreak, and there was extensive damage across much of the Little Rock area. In the end, on April 25th, a total of 50 tornadoes were confirmed, and as I just said, killed 5 people. However, April 26th would be a completely different story, as we would enter triple digits for the first time in this outbreak. Also, it was also less known for its tornadoes, although as they were relatively insignificant in strength, and there were many in number. However, it would be more significant for the hail, wind, and flooding, as well as one event overnight that would precede and directly lead to April 27th. On April 26, 2011, a high risk was issued for parts of Arkansas and Texas. A moderate risk was in effect from Texas to Kentucky as well.
High risk is really bad. That means, you're expecting widespread and highly dangerous severe weather outbreak. The SPC will often issue tornado watches or severe thunderstorm watches in the state, depending on specifically what kind of threat it is. That will have a PDS attached to them, which means particularly dangerous situation, an unusually high threat to life and property with severe weather. So yeah, that's pretty much what a high risk is. About the highest level of most dangerous severe weather you can get.
The tornado threat was now at 30% with a hatched area in it.
If you see a 30% risk, you're expecting an outbreak, a pretty significant outbreak of tornadoes, and definitely some strong, long-tracked EF2 plus within that when you see that 30%.
However, the wind threat had maxed out, reaching the 60% threat with a hatched area, which is the highest threat possible for wind.
60% is maxed out for any probability, especially with wind. At that point, that wind risk alone would constitute a high-risk event. Now with that, they usually only issue those for, the most intense straight-line wind events like a derecho or, a really intense squall line like we had in this case left over from supercells that formed earlier in the day. Now, if you're under one of these, straight line winds are often considered less dangerous than tornadoes just because they don't go as strong, and you can kind of prepare for them in advance because you get severe thunderstorm warnings that have, half an hour of lead time. Mm-hmm. But when you're under 60%, you could definitely expect to see, widespread hurricane force wind gusts, lots of more significant structural damage, more significant tree damage, and damaged infrastructure than you would from a regular 30% wind event.
The hail threat was at 45% with a hatched area too.
45, at that point, basically any strong supercell you see is going to be producing large destructive hail, 2 inches or greater, which is about, for reference, that's about the size of a chicken egg. So, yeah, now hail can be pretty damaging, as we may have discussed.
Another thing to note is some of the CAPE values, shown at the skews right here. In Arkansas, at 12 UTC, or about 7 a.m., it was at 0. By 18 UTC, which is 1 p.m., it was at over 1,190 to be exact. By 7 p.m., or about 0 UTC, it was 1,630 joules per kilogram. In Shreveport, it was much larger. By 18 UTC, which is 1 o'clock in the afternoon, it was at 2,743 joules per kilogram. By 7 p.m., the CAPE came close to cracking 3,000 joules per kilogram, clocking in at 2,874 joules per kilogram.
Those higher CAPE values, more atmospheric instability, you're going to see, the stronger updrafts, more hail, more damaging winds, more precipitation with that. Even if, you didn't see a lot of the really strong, violent tornadoes in the 26th, rather a lot of weaker ones.
As Ethan just said, despite there being a PDS tornado watch out in effect for much of Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas, a lot of these tornadoes were insignificant because they were weak. However, the hail, wind, and flood threats cannot be ignored.
So basically with April 26th, we had, a lot of supercells that formed through, northeast Texas and then parts of, southern Arkansas, Louisiana. And you got a lot of weak tornadoes out of those. But then what happened was later in the day on the 26th through the night, those storms kind of formed to a line. That's where we got that 60% wind risk that we were talking about earlier. Mm-hmm. And that moved across, that eventually moved across the Mississippi River into Mississippi, Alabama, eventually northern Georgia. And that stayed together. And it produced a lot of wind damage, flash flooding, and quite a few more tornadoes across those states. In fact, in the early morning hours of the 27th, we had a number of EF3 tornadoes that touched down through northern Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, and several dozen tornadoes through those states in the morning.
In total, 111 tornadoes were confirmed on April 26th. However, that night, a line of severe thunderstorms moved through Mississippi and Alabama and continued into the morning of April 27th. And at first, people thought that was going to be the big event. However, they would be wrong.
See, what a lot of people said was that, that morning round of thunderstorms was going to bust the event for the rest of the day, and that the second round of supercells that was expected to form behind that, through Mississippi, wasn't going to be as significant. But instead, what happened was you had a much more significant severe weather outbreak.
That line of storms that would move through on the morning of April 27th, 2011, instead of busting the event, it would only destabilize the cap and the cape. What it did was it tore down the cap, and by the time the afternoon happened, all hell broke loose. But that is where we are going to leave it. So stay tuned for part 2 of the 2011 super outbreak. And with that being said, have a wonderful day, guys. Be sure to subscribe, turn on the notifications for part 2. And with that being said, stay safe.